Hey everyone, in this video we're going to talk about the counter-current multiplier system, and I'm going to explain it as simply as possible. This is a follow-on video from my previous video where I talked about the loop of Henle, concentration of urine and production of urine, and the counter-current multiplier as well. But in this video we're going to just focus purely on how the gradient is maintained and formed and how the multiplier works and the specific channels. And then we'll also talk about medications like furosemide and how that causes a diuresis. So in front of you, I'm just going to draw a pretty basic diagram of the loop of Henle. And remember, this loop of Henle, it dives down from superficial renal medulla to deep renal medulla. Because remember, in the previous video, we talked about how the superficial part of the medulla is less osmotic compared to the deep parts of the medulla, which helps us concentrate urine. So on the left, we have the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle, and the direction of flow is down towards the deep medulla. And the features of this that make it important is that it's permeable to water, but not to solutes. Then on the right is the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle with the direction of flow going up superficial. And the important features of this is that it's impermeable to water, and it's got pumps in it that pump solutes out to a gradient of about 200 milliosmoles. So as we know from the previous video, the concentration of the filtrate coming into the loop of Henle is about 300 milliosmol per kilogram of water, and the concentration of the filtrate leaving the loop of Henle is about 100 milliosmoles per kilogram of water. Now, just to set up what's going to happen, we know that on the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle, in blue, we have water that is able to seep out into the interstitium to match whatever the concentration is in the interstitium. So it'll equilibrate with whatever the interstitial osmotic gradient is. And then on the right, in the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle, it's impermeable to water, but it pumps solutes out. So solutes are going to be moving into the interstitium from the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle. So let's just work backwards here. So we know 100 is coming out of the thick ascending limb, and we know it maintains a concentration gradient of 200 milliosmoles, so the interstitium will be about 300 milliosmoles. And the filtrate entering the loop of Henle will just match this, which is 300 milliosmoles per kilogram of water. And again, working backwards, we know that if solutes are being pumped out into the interstitium from the thick ascending limb of the loop of Henle on the right, then we know that the concentration must be greater than 100 the deeper down in the medulla in the thick ascending limb. So let's just put a number in and we'll make it 200. So it's 200 milliosmoles here. That with the direction of flow will become 100 as more solutes are pumped out. And in the interstitium, there's a gradient of 200 milliosmoles. So it'll be 400. So now that 300 in the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle will travel down, and water will leave to match the interstitial gradient. As you can see here, water leaving. And the concentration within the thin descending limb as we go deeper into the medulla will match the interstitial gradient. So it becomes 400. And then again, working backwards, more solutes are pumped out into the interstitium. So from our 200, there has to be a higher gradient, so we'll make it 300 here. And again, the 200 milliosmol gradient means it'll be 500 deeper down the interstitium. So again, in our thin descending limb of the loop of Henle, the solutes are becoming more concentrated as more water is leaving to then be matched or being drawn out into the higher osmotic gradient of the interstitium. So it will match it at about 500 milliosmoles in the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle. So again, we'll do the same thing. We'll repeat it over. That 300, it must be about 400 that then goes into the thick ascending limb. The gradient is 200 milliosmoles. So down at the hairpin turn, we have 600 milliosmoles within the interstitium. Water leaves the thin descending limb of the loop of Henle, and then it equilibrates. So we've got an equilibration of the gradient in the thin descending limb with the outside interstitium, so it becomes 600 milliosmoles. So here we can see the 600 milliosmoles enters the hairpin turn. Now, it's not a perfect system. There's obviously some solutes that are going to leave as well. So as it goes around to that 400, again, you have more osmotic gradient being drawn out, or more solutes being drawn out into the interstitium to create that gradient. So it doesn't answer the whole question here, but it answers most of it. And I'll talk about probably something you're thinking of, which is why it's 600 and not 1200. And I'll explain that further. But first, let's just talk about the channels that create the gradient and pump solutes out of the thick ascending limb into the interstitium. So in purple here, we've got the channels. And then on the right, we'll just diagrammatically draw a cell. And on the right of the cell is the lumen. So this is where the filtrate is. And then on the left is the interstitium. So this is the interstitial gradient that's being created. So there's this type of channel, and it's called a sodium-potassium 2-chloride co-transporter. And essentially what it does is it moves 1 sodium into the cell with 1 potassium and 2 chloride. And then on the interstitial side of the cell, you'll have your sodium-potassium ATPase channels. And the sodium-potassium ATPase moves 3 sodium out and 2 potassium into the cell. And then obviously there's quite a lot of potassium that's then collecting into the cells here, as well as chloride. Chloride generally follows sodium, but there are other channels that manage the potassium, which I talk about in my other videos about potassium handling of the kidney. So this sodium-potassium 2-chloride channel, also known as NKCC2, is the target for medications like Frusemide. So what Frusemide does is it essentially blocks these channels. So it's a loop diuretic. So these channels are found in the loops of Henle, and it blocks these channels. And then what this does is it means that you can't pump solutes out into the interstitium, so your osmotic gradient is destroyed, meaning that your ability for the kidneys to concentrate urine, as described in my previous video, which is dependent on this osmotic gradient, is essentially completely made useless, and you're not able to concentrate urine. And then hence why Frusemide is a really good diuretic. As you can probably expect, if it's blocking this channel and it's stopping your ability to absorb sodium and potassium, and that sodium and potassium is going to remain in the filtrate, then you'll cause a natriuresis and a kaluresis as well. So people who are on Frusemide, especially Frusemide infusions, you should probably monitor their potassium levels. And although not as important, you should also monitor sodium as well. So now let's step back and go back to our original point about the gradient peaking at 600 milliosmoles per kilogram of water. So in textbooks, you'll often read it's 1,200 milliosmoles per kilogram of water is at the deepest parts of the medulla. But when it comes to the solutes and the concentration gradient made, essentially it can't really get much higher than 600. So the solute gradient, or the concentration, it accounts for about 50% of the gradient of the medulla. And this is important because it highlights another mechanism that our kidneys use to concentrate urine, and the other 50% is due to urea. And I explained this further in my previous video, or my video on the loops of Henle and the countercurrent multiplier system as well. So I'll just change it here to 1,200 just so that you're aware, but essentially 50% is from the solutes and 50% is from the urea concentration. So as you can see here, the 300 milliosmoles of filtrate that enters on the descending limb of the loop of Henle, it goes down the descending limb and equilibrates with the interstitium gradient, and that gradient is created by the sodium-potassium 2-chloride channels and the other channels involved that pump sodium and solutes out of the thick ascending limb into the interstitium. And because of this, in its ability to equilibrate because water leaves, you have this gradual increasing concentration the deeper you go into the medulla. And then through this repeated cycling of new filtrate entering at 300 milliosmoles, going down, concentrating, and then going up through the thick ascending limb that then creates that 200 milliosmole gradient. It happens over multiple times. Essentially, this explains why it's called the counter current, meaning that filtrate has entered the thin descending limb and then went up against its gradient along the thick ascending limb. And it happens multiple times, so it's a multiplier, hence why it's called the counter current multiplier system, or the counter current multiplier gradient. I hope this video explains this in a very simple way and a more easily understood way. If you have any questions, anything you want to add, feel free to drop it in the comments, or anything you want me to cover. And don't forget to subscribe to help support the channel.